But yeah, I don't know, where should we get started? Maybe we can get started with what is liquid democracy, because it's a term that I've heard before, but I don't really understand properly what it means.
Well, it means probably different things to different people. It certainly means different stuff to me than it does to probably most people. But the basic principle is that you can, at any time that you want, you can either vote directly on an issue. So it's a combination of direct democracy with representative democracy. But it's a form of radical representative democracy, or delegative democracy, because you can choose a representative from anyone, your friends, teachers, experts, someone you trust, basically. And then they, in turn, can delegate their votes. So basically the votes flow through a network of trusted relationships.
And can I delegate to different people on different issues, or is it I delegate to one person and they make the decision?
Well, for me, I mean, because I started... there were two of us that started to use the term. John Donoso in the States, Psyche, was the first guy to use it online in, I don't know exactly when, 2000, 2001, something like that, I think. And I started to use it for funny reasons here in London, just to really capture the idea that what you want is a more fluid and flexible democracy, not some sort of rigid kind of vote on everything once every 4 years. So for me, it certainly means that you can delegate to as many people as you want on particular topics. So you can divide your single vote up into topics. So you can vote on the environment, on your local schools, on taxation, whatever you want. And you can choose those themes and choose a trusted representative on those. Yep. In fact, for me, you could choose more than one trusted representative. Yeah. It's just the important is the fluidity and the flexibility of your ability to express yourself politically through people that you trust on particular issues.
Right. Yeah. So I feel like it's an idea that I've heard before, definitely. So, and as I understand it, it's instead of voting yes or no on an issue, I vote to delegate my vote to David. David decides to delegate his vote to someone else, and then eventually you get high enough up the chain, or someone in the middle of the chain decides I'm going to vote yes or no on this issue, and everyone who's delegated their vote to me goes the same way that I do. Has it ever been tried anywhere?
Oh, yes.
Practically, and how did those experiments work out?
Well, John Donoso's came from basically from BitTorrent kind of thinking and world, and he was developing software. I was developing software, but the guy to really first try it was a guy called Mikael Nordfors in Sweden, and he didn't call it liquid democracy. He called it democracy 2.0. And it was tried really early in a suburb of Sweden, and it actually elected a representative there who of a very small party. It started as a school teacher discussing what democracy should be with his students, and the students came up with the idea. And then they looked around for software, and Michael was creating software, and they started their own party for a candidate, and they were elected in their first go.
Do you know how many people voted in this election?
It was tiny. I'm trying to remember the name of it. It was basically I don't know. It was a few thousand people. They have very small sort of boroughs, if you like, there. And they got maybe 1,000 votes, which was enough to get a representative. But what they said was particularly interesting was that because what happened is that as is the way with, if you like, people who use liquid democracy, the delegate doesn't when they interface with Parliament, they usually go to Parliament and do not put forward their own ideas. They go back to the community, to the website,
Right.
and they just carry the message, if you like. So at any time there might be an issue coming up in Parliament, and it is discussed in the forums, and then the votes come through, and then they say, our community wants this. And what they found was that the other politicians took them really more seriously, even though they were a very small group, because they knew they were representing, if you like, the diverse opinion in their community. So I shot an interview with them, actually. They were really interesting.
Well, I guess like my thoughts when you talk about this kind of stuff go to a number of places. Number one is it afflicted by the same problems that we have with regular democracy, or the way that voting is done at the moment? So you have to be anonymous, but your vote also has to be trusted. So no one should know how I voted, but I should be able to confirm that somehow my vote was cast and does count. Like, I'm not sure how that would work in liquid democracy. Two, it's like, what if the person who I delegate to doesn't cast a vote? Is that an issue? Does that come up? I'm curious also, in this small experiment, did most people cast their own votes, or did most people delegate? And then also, what was the media landscape like? Does it end up being that instead of like people campaigning at a leadership level where all of the candidates are like, please vote for me, instead of that, there's just a much larger pool of candidates who all are saying, please vote for me?
Yes, it tends to flatten there. But the experiment that I was talking about was very early. I mean, I don't know, 2001, 2003, something like this. So since then, it then kind of, around about, I think, 2005, 6, I sort of, the two projects met in Berlin, and I gave some talks, developed some software. John Donoso and Christian developed some software. Mine was open source, theirs was closed source. And it disappeared off the radar, and then it got picked up by the Pirate Party. So it's been used quite extensively by the
Pirate Party.
The Pirate Party. So the Pirate Party started in Sweden when Pirate Bay got shut down. And it's kind of radical politics that moved away from the issue of copyright and what have you. And it's big in Iceland, Germany, Sweden. They got people elected to the European Parliament, and to it did very well. And they experimented quite heavily with liquid democracy. Okay. And then the Net Party in Argentina as well. And so it's been used quite a lot extensively since then. But I would say, from my point of view, not successfully and not in the right way. Okay. But your question was more about how it changes the problems or the issues you have with normal representative, or how it differs from that. So, I mean, one thing it does is that because you can always just continue, you don't have to do anything different. You can just say, I'm going to delegate all my votes to this one person that I've never met every 4 years, and that's what we do at the moment. And you could just continue to do that. But what tends to happen after a while is when you get moved by a particular issue and you see someone talk, or it might be a local school teacher, it might be a blogger, a journalist, it might be whoever, that people start to pull their votes closer to them and closer to these people. And also what starts to happen is people no longer want to delegate their votes to people who they can't have a dialogue with, or they don't know how they voted on their behalf.
Super interesting, yeah. It's kind of like a strengthening of social ties, where the way that people will delegate votes to you is if you're respected within the community or something, or if people trust your judgment on issues.
Yeah. Interestingly, it also does it also provides an extra little incentive for like bloggers and journalists to do a good job and to have dialogue with people, because not only now do they get readers, but they get people delegating votes to them.
Yeah.
So it provides an almost alternative reputation economy in civil society that way.
Do I know how many people delegate their votes to me? Has that ever been done?
Okay, so
does it? I mean, I'm wondering. Essentially, I'm kind of wondering if it turns into a bit of a social media frenzy, where
Well, certainly you can get quite competitive. It's like I've got not just so many likes, I've got so many followers, but I'm representing this many people in my community. Also, I mean, the way that, for instance, the first communities picked it up, the Pirate Party and what have you, was all about radical transparency. So they would insist that every vote has to. There's no such thing as a secret ballot or anonymous voting, and that you had, if you were going to vote, you had to stand up in public, and people had to see that. So you could see how everyone voted, how you voted, and so forth. And most of the systems really are still created that way. But right now, what's great is that one of my favourite projects called originally Democracy OS, like operating system, from Pia Mancini in Argentina, which is now democracy.earth. So they're basically a really good development team, really good practical team, grounded on a real party based on campaigning. And Democracy Earth is smart contracts on the Ethereum blockchain for liquid democracy, plus self-sovereign identity. That's the ability to issue your own basically private public key, and then have other bodies attest certain attributes of you, your age or where you live, or and you can then decide whether or not how much to reveal and prove certain things without giving away too much. So it's basically a very powerful infrastructure for political citizenship, as well as having provable, if you like, contracts on the blockchain for liquid democracy. So
the self-sovereign identity stuff I've heard about, that's quite interesting, because it's built on this premise that if the UK government wants to, using their private, it's kind of like digital signatures, where if they say that I'm a citizen of Great Britain, then because it's encrypted using their private key, everyone can verify that it was in fact the British government who did this. And you stop forged passports and things like this, essentially. Or it's very difficult to forge things that are on this shared blockchain.
And there's a tension between people who want to do that kind of, if you like, top down and centrally, or with approved bodies. But this is something that, regardless of any organization, you have the ability to issue your own global sovereign identity. And then it's up to you who you get to, if you like, countersign or improve. And it's also allows you to do things like say, I am over 21, but I'm not telling you how old I am.
Right. Do you know how that works on a technical level? Like, is it the case that me, as I exist on this blockchain, and all this information that exists about me, so it definitely exists there because it's been signed by other parties or whatever. But if I wanted to conceal my age or my citizenship, how would I do that?
I tell you the truth. It's a active research topic. I've always understood that that's possible, and there's some kind of obvious ways that it's possible to do. I mean, you can just get someone to attest that you are under 21, and you trust that person. They've signed your identity, right? So I can now basically pass that proof on that these people have kind of.
Right, but if it was in fact a proof of the day I was born, so if it was a birth certificate type proof, and that existed on the blockchain, but I only wanted certain people to be able to see it, would that be possible? Or like say
you can effectively have onion rings of layers of information on which you decide going further down the proof, you've got zero knowledge proofs that you could take advantage of, but that's not been done here.
Okay, and this is all done on this like smart contract type thing.
Yes, but zero knowledge proofs aren't in like Ethereum and what have you, as far as I know right now. I'm pretty sure they're not. That's a whole other kind of Zcash. All this kind of technology. My take on that is that you can pretty well. There are some exceptions, but you can pretty well do what you want with cryptography once you lay the foundations right. And a huge amount of effort and intellect has been put into that area of security and flexibility, so that it scales globally. But in some ways, the aspect that's not being emphasized is how far you can get with, if you like, civil society having quite basic cryptographic tools. Okay. So the fact is that, public key cryptography isn't out there except for a very few people, and just getting the basics out there and allowing us to certify each other can get a very, very long way.
And what are the applications? So just in the thing that we were discussing with age, one thing that immediately scares me is that sometimes it's actually quite useful to lie about your age, and probably a lot of people who are underage drinkers or whatever, just, there are lots of people who have fake IDs and things like this. And it is.
Well, that's the nice thing about self-sovereign identity. In a way, that you can have multiple identities. So you can create as many identities as you want. It's just that some won't have the same history, won't be as trusted as others. So it's a bit like, creating new characters in World of Warcraft or something like this,
Oh, okay. It's going to be at that level. It's not going to be at the level of issuing new passports or something. Like if the government gets involved, and because the way that
I've heard what's happening in China, just
but that's quite scary to me.
It's very. I mean, this is going to transform society. So, like, it has the possibility of Stasi-like states that know absolutely everything about you, and there is no, autonomous zone you can escape to and be free because everything is monitored. To enabling, on the other extreme, citizens and groups to claim back a lot of control over things like, finance and the way votes are expressed against big powers. And we basically have a language or a framework over which that battle is going to be debated and fought and tooth and nail by vested powers and hopefully by civil society. So it can go either way.
Do you have any case studies that come to mind of this clawing back of power and what that might look like? Just because, or in terms of getting a bit more concrete, what's a classic use case for this self-sovereign identity on a blockchain with digital signatures and verifiable statements or claims?
It's never happened in history, I don't think, where cryptography has, if you like, got out to the masses. Or this sort of.
What would that look like? So everyone has public keys and private keys, and what can they now do that they can't do? So layered on top of that, you have the ability to create many forms of money, and also many forms of legal organization and many forms of democratic or social organization. And what it basically does is the same. It makes it far cheaper to create more complex and richer social structures with money and with legal cooperative forms. So at the moment, you can create a company and it might cost you like, £20, £30 a year, and you have to fill in some forms, and then you have 2 or 3, 4, 5, 6 structures you can choose. But that is all quite laborious, and it's not something, maybe 20 years ago, people wouldn't create legal, very few people would have their own company. Now there's quite a lot of self-employed people. I think as we move forwards, you'll probably be creating companies on a weekly basis. And so these companies then become like your voluntary association, your a project or holiday you want to go on with friends, and you will be able to start building the values, richer values, into those corporations, not just. But can't I already do some? So I'm thinking, if to register a company, it's essentially registering on Companies House, and in terms of tax implications and liability things. So if I register a limited liability company, that just means that I now am less responsible for losses or whatever. And then in order to affiliate with different groups, like my local church or whatever, I can just do that via Facebook groups and mailing lists and in-person interactions.
So you want to know what's different?
But like what does this digital element add that
That question reminds me of like when I was at medical school and I was showing people the internet.
Okay.
So I was showing people multimedia. You could click on this word and you can see an image or a heart sound, and it can come from anywhere in the world. And the doctors and even other students would come along and they'd sort of be really fascinated by the screen, but they say, well, I can do that in any case. I just go to the bookshelf and I get up the book. What's the big deal? And in exactly the same way, the only thing the internet did was reduce the time and cost to getting that sound or that image. I mean, you could always go to it, right? So it reduces the transactional cost of getting the information to near zero. I say it basically revolutionized gossip. The gossip is the moving of information from one place to another, whether it's a picture of a cat or a scientific paper, and that had a huge effect, right? These smart contracts based on provable, legally binding signatures, right, revolutionize power. They revolutionize, and it'll have exactly the same effect. You'll get all sorts of new forms of power. You'll get, for instance, you could create global associations and global structures and cooperate with people, and not just with the simple voting structures that you have now in the 304.
I guess I'm trying to tease apart to what the core bit is. And do you think it is that
for
word
instance,
that you use, the legally binding bit?
How would you put liquid democracy into a conventional legal structure? It's not easy to do. How would you form a multinational cooperative of cooperatives? Right. How would you, in environmental sectors, make international partnerships that embedded only green supply chains? Right. These things are incredibly expensive and difficult to do. But if the code was there, you could just drag and drop and put that up in 3 minutes.
Okay, the green supply chains one is interesting then, because at the moment it's very difficult to verify whether a supplier. So if every single supplier had some kind of a public address, and then it was also possible for them to get external validation that they themselves were green or whatever, and they also had a link to every single place that they sourced information or sourced materials from, then you could kind of just go down the chain and find any gaps.
So that's I moved off liquid democracy in about 2003, 4, something like that, because it was just individuals clicking on things, and then you could get this nice visual feedback and see what the vote was. But I started to realize that that's only a tiny part of what it means to be human and political. Right. A lot of it is about conversation in groups. So I wanted to know how to create groups. So I started to play with fluid groups, how you'd create these fluid groups, and what did that mean in terms of a party or a fluid group. And out of that, I started to work with law. So I created this thing called liquid law, which is a domain-specific legal language to define the terms of reference of that group. Out of that comes this, so you start getting a richer sort of, you've got basically a legal language, an open source legal language that people use. You've got richer forms of voting, and you've got richer forms of currency, and all of that stuff now can be robustly cryptographically done in a number of ways, but one of the most significant ones we know about at the moment is the blockchain. Right. So that, for me, as soon as that came out, as soon as Ethereum came out, I was right in there saying, this is the language I've been wanting for the last 15 years. Yeah,
it's just so difficult because whenever we think of legally binding or binding in any way, it's very difficult for us to get beyond the court system and police and enforcement and this kind of thing. So the concept of something being cryptographically binding or
that's a misunderstanding though. It's like, I mean, it's not, it's obviously a fascinating part that something can be completely autonomous, that you can program smart contracts that move money this way or move decision making that way based on other smart contracts purely in a virtual world without any human intervention. And it's kind of really, it freaks people out and fascinates people and is really important in a lot of domains. But that whole story completely confuses people because that's nothing to do with what this stuff will do. This stuff instead will make it easy for human beings to create better forms of arbitration. new forms of jewelry, new forms of business relationships, or educational relationships, and so. So human beings are in an arbitration process. You get a panel of people, but how you select that panel, where they come from, all this does is reduce the admin to near zero and add provability to what happened when at what time, without it doesn't remove human beings from making the decisions, because people vote. And you can use Ethereum to take those voting inputs and make decisions, right? Or other blockchain, or indeed non-blockchain systems. And there's quite a number of interesting ones of those based on PKI. So public key cryptography. So the important thing to concentrate on is not the automatic virtual domain of autonomous organizations. That's really fun and really fascinating. The most important thing is we have the ability to claim back law and make it our own, and to sculpt far deeper and richer forms of human association out of it. And arbitration is a great example. At the moment, you have a dispute or you fall out with someone. What can you do? Well, it's really expensive, really time consuming. You have a family dispute or a problem. Right. There's no reason why people online couldn't volunteer time and services, and them. People take online courses, and depending on various reputations within that context, you could quickly assemble groups of people who are good facilitators, knowledgeable about accounting or whatever the particular issue is, and you could be paying for that service with some currency that you earn by helping the local community. You could do all this sort of stuff, and previously you just could make a website. But now you can create that social organization. And there are literally millions of them that have never been created in human history before, that you'll have a language you can use to create these things with. And then if it works, and you create it here, someone in Japan can fork it. Right. And they get it up there at zero cost.
Yeah, I guess, I definitely feel like this is a whole arena which I don't understand properly yet. I'm still at the stage where I'm getting to properly being able to understand it. But my first question is, a lot of this stuff seems to, so in order for there to be human involvement, there needs to be human involvement, as like to say it in a weird way, but there needs to be that voluntary base of people that are willing to contribute in these arbitration matters, where like if you have a dispute within your family or whatever, there needs to be an incentive for some knowledgeable professional halfway across the world to get involved. And you think that,
well, for instance, I definitely want to do an example of that. So the sort of thing that I would do, classically, I've been involved with a number of collectives and online organizations, and there are flame wars and vicious things that always go on, often for no good reason, right? So I know, I've got the exact stories in my head of various groups, some of that I know about, or some of the other people have told me about. Let's say you join an online collective, right? And you're working hard, right? As part of your membership, you could commit to certain, let's say, I don't know, an hour a year of time to, let's say, arbitration, right? And another group, the other group does the same, and then they can make a contract between each other. And so if your group is in conflict with another group, or there's an individual within your group that is in conflict, I don't know, with the board or what have you, then that individual can basically say, I want arbitration, pay with their own time, a time-based currency or a community, a mutual credit currency. There's all sorts of ways they do it. It doesn't need to be cash, right? And then that currency is used to incentivize an external group to come in to arbitrate that, and they get paid in that currency. And now they can use that when they have an arbitration to call in another external group. Right. And all this happens without any cash, but it's systematized and organized, and every group would find it in its interest. And so it becomes a sustainable nexus of value exchange. Right. Now you could use hard cash as well. So, I mean, you could do it with businesses. And now you're starting to compete with big business that do arbitration and facilitation, right? And lawyers. So you could start to reduce the cost of that, using real cash.
What kind of dispute are you imagining when you talk about this? Like how, on what level of scale? Is this like a small thing, or is this like huge dispute? Because
any level of dispute. So, I mean, but basically the ones that I would say, generally when you come up with a new community currency or a new system, it's pretty useless if you go, unless it's dramatically more efficient and saves a lot of money. If you go up against existing well-known and well-respecting competitors in a way. So what you want to do is find an area where lots of people are suffering and there is no solution. And I think there's a huge amount of arbitration that can happen between friends, groups and family, which at the moment there's nothing we can do about. I mean,
I don't know. It's like, I don't know what it is that sits uneasy, but to me it's like, you have a spectrum, and if it's a dispute between me and a friend and we can't decide where to go for dinner or something, it's so tiny that we're never going to get an external arbitrator to come in and resolve that, because it's just interpersonal conflicts.
Of course, if it's just a friend over dinner.
If it's like my roommate is super messy and it's annoying me and we end up getting into a fight, I'm not really going to use an external arbitrator.
I mean, you wouldn't want to.
If it's like I've lent someone £1,000 and they haven't paid me back, then now we're into somewhat of a grey area.
I remember a story like someone in Barcelona I just met, and they said when they were 14, they played the bass track, and they had this track. They had this song that they'd written, and they gave it to someone who was 2 years above them because he had a band, and he also played guitar on it, and he'd written the song, the lyrics and everything, and the guy just kind of stole it and put it out on the radio, and it became a kind of local hit and what have you.
Yeah.
And what could he do?
But so, right, exactly. And my question would be, how do smart contracts help him in that situation?
Well, he could basically, when he went to the local group now, he could just say on his mobile phone, here's my song, touch this or agree to this, and now we've got a little project together for doing this work together. Right, and it built into that, and straight away there's nothing to sort about. I mean, you can touch it, you can look at it, you can see it, but it's become a trusted thing. And now built into that agreement, if there's any dispute over it, there's an automatic arbitration that costs you nothing or costs you £10 or something.
So it's like a record, so he can digitally sign this thing. So this is what you mean by if public key cryptography was available to the masses, then as soon as he makes this song, he has an app that's running on his phone that he presses a button. Okay, now I've signed this thing and everyone knows it's mine.
And this is happening. So Benji Rogers has got a music project on the blockchain. I think it's on Ethereum, actually.
Benji, okay.
And it is basically, it was launched about a year and a half ago. I met him, and he's a super smart, intention and motivated guy, and it's basically about exactly that. If you play trumpet or guitar or you write the lyrics, whatever you do on the track gets time stamped and your rights embedded into that exchange. So as soon as you assemble a complex production, you know exactly who's done what when to that.
Interesting. And if it's just kind of in the infrastructure, in the fabric of society, then you don't even need to think about it. You just, if there is a dispute, then you can look back in the history and be like, well, it's all immutable. There's a record of everything. Yeah,
let's say this podcast you're doing, we've been talking about it because I wanted to do a podcast as well, and I will be doing, and we would have like a range of 60 different ways to cooperate, or hundreds of them, and some good ones that we like. I say, why don't we do that one, the Lucy Association? You say, oh, I'd like to do this one because it's got like great ethical sustainability, whatever properties you like, and we debate about it, or we might just take the one that all the other kids are using, right, sort of thing. We just say yes. We don't think about it too much because it's just a quick little thing we're trying, but that would then have flexibility in it, so we could renegotiate and what have you. And also it'd be kind of fun to do. We'd sort of probably sit down and have a drink after like 3 months and say, all right, we tried that, now let's take it a bit more seriously, and we'd show some videos and say, well, we could do it that way, that's what like this band did, or we could do it this way. So it becomes almost spiritual rather than a boring piece of bureaucracy. We're looking at the values we have, and we're deciding what sort of way of relating. Like, in terms of currency, there are Islamic finance without interest and certain moral values in that, while other currencies have different sorts of values, right?
That's interesting.
And you'd start to choose which one you want.
I've never heard of blockchain as revolutionizing bureaucracy before, but that's potentially an interesting argument. I mean, that's something that I would be quite interested. I feel like in general, society at the moment is overly bureaucratized, and it's very difficult to explain to people because the counterexample is always something like Grenfell, and it's like, oh, well, if there's too much red tape and too much bureaucracy, how could something of this have happened? And so I find it very difficult because I want to argue, well, yeah, but you get like £100 fine for parking in the wrong place for 2 minutes because there's cameras watching those things, even though you were causing no one any harm, which to me is excessive bureaucracy. While also saying that, yes, what happened at Grenfell was terrible.
Well,
and
why is it excessive? I mean, you could call that a bug in the system, right? And they're often, just because it's so expensive and so clumsy, to get a bit more sophisticated about it.
Yeah.
But, fast forward 100 years' time, there's no reason why a lot of context can't be taken into automatic case there. Not automatic as in machine automatic, but through a process of common law, you have debated and looked at these things and tweaked the sets of principles that apply to that context, right? Yeah. So you could say that's a case of moral inefficiency, the parking meter automatically fining everyone. I mean, for instance, why do we decide that super rich people are fined the same as like people who are just, like a nurse?
Right, exactly.
Is that the right thing? But we could debate that and say, no, actually, we should kind of punish people equally in pain terms, in sense, and that at the moment is impossible to do.
Right.
And all the time we've got this battle between the sort of the state or people, your neighbours, anyone knowing too much about you and using that information as stuff for moral good. And that goes with biometric medical information, that goes for everything. So right at the heart of this is identity and your control over it. And that's why it's so vital to get that out early to people and to educate people about that, because your digital identity will otherwise be stolen as much as your Facebook identity is. And your digital identity in terms of cryptographic legal identity is your citizenship. It is It is your fundamental domain of human rights in the future, right? And if you do not have control over that, other people will do. I mean, it's
that's super. It's an idea that I've heard several times over the past few weeks. Digital identity, and what does that mean to you? Like,
it's literally your legal personhood.
Okay.
Right. So
and that entitles you to certain things like
access to alcohol, cigarettes, whether you can get this training course, your job, whether you can travel, how much money you get, your taxation, your history, your pension, every single thing of any significance it gives you access to. I mean, you should look at it like in Estonia. Have you seen the setup there? But because they have robust digital identity, I don't think it's done in an ideal way. But in terms of an early way of doing it, it's pretty damn good. When you look at, you can just use it to log in and see your medical records, right, online. And when you look at those records, every single person who has seen your records, even just glanced at it, an X-ray, a nurse, a doctor, is provably on that, because they've had to be cleared, use their digital identity to view it, and then that's logged. So you can see, and if you feel that people who shouldn't be looking at your personal health records are looking at it, you can now complain. And you can do all sorts of things with that sort of stuff. But without the robust digital identity, you can't do any of it.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, you can do it with brute force medieval law.
Right, and it's just becomes... I mean, without digital identity, it would be almost impossible to tell all the people that had looked at your medical record.
Yes, I mean, you wouldn't get someone to sign going in and opening out, and you would put. Sure, we at the moment put. I mean, because I have 10 years history in that kind of medical area, you put safeguards in place, but there are ways around it all the time, and there are bugs basically. I don't know what else they call it. There's some way around it, and sometimes you want to allow some flexibility, some ways around things. You want some fudge, but people think that you can't use like blockchain to create fuzzy like social situations, but you sure can. You can make it as weird and random and quirky as you want. It's just a language that you can use to write whatever arrangement you want, So that's the basic point. It gives us the possibility, if we understand it and we take control of it. I mean, it's open source, we can use it, but big powers are investing and can also use it against us. So it gives us the possibility to claim a lot, or to write our own legal arrangements and to make our own political organizations, political parties, and to democratize law, accountancy, and money. And at the other extreme, it gives other people the power to monitor everything we do and completely remove all the current freedoms we have.
Wow, yeah. All right, let's do a little mini break. I'm just going to check the cameras are running and that everything is. We're 40 minutes in.
Cool.
Have a little pit stop.
Can I nick a biscuit?
Yeah, go for it.
One reference I can.
Oh, can you just move it out of the... Just leave it on the chair, maybe. There. Oops. Yeah, and so all of this stuff is, in general, why people are so excited about blockchain, beyond the kind of hype that's being generated from people who have made a lot of money by investing early in Bitcoin.
Yeah. I mean, you've got Bitcoin, and then you've got the smart contract stuff, and then you've got a whole world after that of new stuff.
Yeah.
So,
but the digital identity stuff does seem to me like a more concrete case where it's kind of like infrastructure for the 21st or 22nd centuries, where it's very difficult to imagine a world in the future where we're not more integrated into the internet. And people talk about IoT and various different things, and cars that are connected up to the internet and all this kind of stuff. But it's clear that the internet will go through some kind of transformation where our real identities are much more coupled with the things that we do online. And there will be need for being able to verify who you are and what permissions you have in society or whatever.
I really see it as worthwhile considering the internet as as this domain of information, what I called a revolution in gossip, right? And this other stuff, a revolution in power. These are completely different languages, completely different domains, completely separate.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would just be very skeptical that... So even with Bitcoin, right, it's like it promised to be this democratic thing where everyone now had access to money that wasn't controlled by government and all this stuff. And what ends up happening is you have 1,000 people control half of all Bitcoin or something, was the most recent statistics that I read.
Yeah, I mean, I was never interested in Bitcoin remotely. But, it's just cash.
But like there was an article this week that was Bitcoin is none of the things that it promised to be. So it's supposed to be decentralized. It's not really decentralized because all of the mining is done by a relatively small group of people. Most cryptocurrencies seem to suffer from that problem where it's very difficult to incentivize.
I wouldn't say most.
Or many, I think.
I know, but people are looking backwards 7 years at a very early... I mean, imagine making this stuff up back then. I mean, I saw like the very early experiments and everything because I was really interested in... I was making my own kind of weird digital currencies at that time. So, when this... You just make it up and you guess what's going to happen to the system over the next 20 years, right? And so there was there was an interesting experiment, and it didn't quite turn out how, there's it had never been done before. So looking at that and saying, hey, they said it was going to be decentralized and it isn't, is like just saying, I don't know, my first painting was shit. I mean, so what? And now a lot has been learned from that. And there are, if you've got a language and a set of tools, and you can create amazing structures. You can create them centralized, decentralized. You can, radically decentralized. You can do what you want with this stuff. And just looking at Bitcoin, or even just looking at what people understand as Ethereum now, isn't looking at the it's like looking at the very first internet and seeing a bit of text and it coming over slowly and saying, oh, wow, they said it was going to be amazing. In fact, you have to wait for ages for it, because just like with the internet, a whole domain of gossip opened up. In this, you're looking at the very first steps in opening up power.
Yeah.
right? And like when I try and describe what I'm absolutely certain I've been seeing it happen, just like I saw the internet happen. What will happen to votes and money? Let's say if you look back from 50 years' time, something like that, we'll have the same impression about voting or using a bank and bank accounts and these spreadsheets. We'll have the same impression that we currently now have about Morse code.
Okay.
It was like did it. I mean, it was kind of cool, and you could send stuff over, and you could communicate. But now we use video. It looks and feels entirely different, right? And we use the internet. We won't be using numbers like we did. We won't be having spreadsheets like we did. We won't even think of votes and money. There'll be a sort of flow of value that we will be using visualization and all sorts of ways to interact with our supermarket and our business and our employment and our government. And that is just because the current stuff we call votes and money is medieval technology.
Yeah.
I mean,
that's really interesting. Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that gets made a lot is at the moment, if you look at blockchains and things, they have all these weird hash signatures and lots of weird strings of numbers and letters, and it doesn't really make sense. But that's just because we're at a relatively immature stage where once all of this stuff is actually mature, no one's ever going to need to know what their specific address is on Ethereum, because it will all just be, it'll have a UI in front of it. It will have.
But what counts is who designs that UI and how transparent it is. Because with a UI and with code, you can fool everyone. And if this genuinely is now the future expression of power, which is what I'm saying it is, right? And that's democratic power and financial power, then it's absolutely essential that source code is open and the design is open, and that we can create our own stuff out of it and test it and look at it and examine it, because it is the creation and the ability to create those interfaces and those social arrangements, which is the community-based and individual-based, and I would emphasize community as well, small community. It is their future political power relations with other larger groups, multinationals, governments, or what have you. And just putting a nice interface on some contracts with an algorithm that no one understands would be a disaster.
Right.
And that's why I'm interested in domain-specific languages, legal languages, which means these smart contracts should be legible to a 10-year-old.
Yeah, that's going to be very difficult given how complex modern law is. Even if you try and read some law, it's very difficult to understand a lot of it unless you have the training.
You need to flip that, right? That's a lawyer or someone saying, look at this huge, like these 100 volumes of stuff. There's no way that you can do that. Yeah. I mean, personally, I laugh at that. I say, look at Python code or Perl code for a 3D rendering. That's complicated. Your legal stuff is kids play, right?
Okay. Yeah.
Right? In terms of complexity, right? But that's not the point. I mean, the real point is what you can do with a domain-specific language, right? And a DSL is a simplification for a current domain that anyone vaguely competent in that domain can use. And you can have millions of the things. So if you want to do a DSL for your housing association, then yes, your grandmother can use it and a 10-year-old can use it, and it works well for that. And it doesn't work for all cases, but 95% of them. If you want some custom code made, you go to the equivalent of a lawyer and you get something special and new made. But that should be open source, and if someone else wants that, they can fork it.
Right. Or you do like the programming language paradigm, which is that you might not have a domain-specific language just for your housing association, but there is a Python equivalent which has some language features that make it readable and easy to understand, and you can borrow someone else's housing code association contract and just
but literally the code should be readable. I mean, that's why literate languages and DSLs are so important in this context, because we're not talking just about shoving pixels on the screen. We're talking about political power, and therefore what will happen is if you use a traditional paradigm of smart contracts or computer languages, we're replacing lawyers just with coders, and there's a new priesthood of powerful people who will reveal or not what's in their interest to the public at
Right.
cost. Well, if it is a generally rich, functional, open source legal language, and in French and German and all the, that's what we're looking for here. Is
Okay, so you're thinking of a language more like English rather than, or like a
or
language
French or
that's,
German. It's literally
not a programming language.
Yeah, and you could call it pigeon law or something like that if you want. I called it liquid. Okay, so I mean, I can tell you the history of this idea, but it basically it's happening already, and there's several projects on it, and I've been working on it since 2003, and it will definitely it will. So one way of describing Ethereum is like you know the story of Napster and what Napster did to the music industry. So it's Napster for law.
Okay.
Right, or I called it Ebola for accountancy. So it basically can have as dramatic an effect on these sorts of institutions, law and accountancy, as Napster and file sharing did for the music industry.
Yeah, it's just, I think the tricky part is that because those industries seem so entrenched and have been around for so, like, we imagine the legal infrastructure that we had has been around almost longer than nation states. I think like this idea of a judiciary and this idea of resolving conflicts between like citizens or people in a society.
There was a time before computers. There was a time before democracy. I mean, we're just at that point now, and it's absolutely obvious we are.
Because the concept of a strong justice system is, precedes the necessity for a nation state or any of this kind of thing. Like even in the US, they were very concerned with the legal infrastructure almost long before they decided to.
And that thinking's so important. I mean, that's the thing. I mean, design thinking, legal thinking, philosophy, ethics, documentary, all that stuff. But now we have a language in which we can far more flexibly and at lower cost craft more beautiful social arrangements. That's what's different. Before, we had to do these very expensive bureaucracies and go to the library. There's hundreds of tomes, and then you have to have people who study it for like 50 years, and a whole profession builds up around that. Hugely expensive. And that exactly the same that happened with the internet in terms of getting information and books off a library shelf. We're now in, let's say, the very beginnings of an equivalent revolution in power.
Okay. Well, let's watch this space, I think, and see what happens. I mean, it sounds very exciting, because I think one thing that I felt is being back in England.
I'd also be scared.
Yes.
Excited and scared.
If you're concerned that the Western world is kind of stagnating or something, that like sometimes people feel like this, that all the development has kind of been done and we have our infrastructure, and our challenge now is not necessarily building more bridges, but making sure the ones that we have don't collapse, things like this, then I feel like this idea is quite revolutionary in many ways.
Well, if you want to stop something collapsing, then just use the language to make stuff stronger. I mean, you don't have to. It's a language of power. So if you want to create more robust military organizations, more robust police, more secure financial markets, if you want to just entrench the status quo, you've got a powerful language to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just a tool in the end, right? But the interesting thing is it's an open source tool that now we can start using.
Does all of this stuff need buy-in from lawyers and from people that currently have power?
Yes and no. In other words, you can do quite a lot, as Bitcoin and so forth have shown, by creating kind of off-grid structures. If you've got a lot of people using the stuff, that's de facto power, right? But the fact is lawyers and banks and businesses and governments are taking this very seriously, and it has huge potential for both cost savings and addressing. So it doesn't need to be either or. You can create smart contracts which are also readable in law and human readable, and do the same that Creative Commons did for their licenses, make them machine readable, human readable, and legally readable, if you like.
Cool.
And so there's no reason why, and it's essential that we do that for the future of power on this planet.
Okay, it's very exciting. Okay, we're up to 54 minutes. Shall we change topics?
Yeah,
briefly?
definitely, because I didn't want to even talk about that stuff.
Oh, well, I mean, it was super interesting. I think it's a very different take on a lot of these things than I've heard before. So it's quite good. Maybe I'm just in different circles. But,
No, it isn't.
so-
It is. It is. There, there are a few people who are talking about that, but you will definitely see it get bigger over the next 2-3 years.
Okay, great, cool. So we can talk about federated wikis, which was what someone was talking about downstairs. We can talk about your time in the medical profession and
let's get off technology.
Okay.
I mean, I would like to talk sometime about this writing platform. I'll just say a little bit about that. Is that rather than just talking about smart contracts, you see, the reason I went off liquid democracy and also the currency stuff a lot is I wanted to work with physical spaces and facilitation and how people converse, and that is both using video and theatre. So I worked a lot in art and interactive theatre and installations and these sorts of things. And also in how social groups worked and how all the different forms of facilitation you can.
So what were some of your favourite projects that you did when you were in this theatre interaction space?
Favourite projects? I mean, some of them are just fun experiments. So the one I really like, actually, that's what made me start to use this term liquid democracy, because I initially started it for science, right? But we can talk about that. So it doesn't have to be used just for politics. It can be used for peer review. That's what I started for medical peer review in 1990. I developed the system to select through network recommendations the peer review panel, because I was creating this kind of wiki for medical student writing, and the professors would come in, someone loved it, and someone would say, "Whoa, that's a bit dodgy. You just got students writing this stuff. How can you prove the authority?" So I wanted a bottom-up way to prove the authority. So I wanted other students to rate other students and then go up the chain, and that's what I was working with. You can call it liquid democracy. But later on, I started to play with PGP, currencies and voting systems through messaging, Java XML type messaging, XML based messaging. And then I got an art commission. Well, actually, my partner at the time, Dilek Winchester, who's we wrote an application to a theatre in a festival in London, Stoke Newington Festival, for the Turkish community. And the funny thing the strange thing about the Turkish community is it's come over in London. It's come over in a succession of waves based on political unrest. So these communities do not speak to each other, and it's very hard they have different papers. They have, you have left wing, right wing. You have, Kurdish, Armenian. You have, about 5-6 big groups, and we were trying to bring them all together in one event. And Dilek said, I know what they all have in common, and that's yogurt, because they all worship yogurt. I mean, she was brought up making yogurt. She had a grandmother, and
yogurt's very good in Turkish cuisine. Yeah,
and the Armenians say they invented it. There's fantastic stories about Danone being smuggled over on a handkerchief because it was illegal to bring the live culture to America, and how the Armenian, there's all this stuff, and everyone claims it as their own. So I wrote this kind of play or concept around that, of this political party stroke factory called MYCP, the MCYP, the Multicultural Yogurt Party, which was designed to worship and manufacture multicultural yogurt, and that's because there's several different cultures of yogurt, and we wanted to see whether they would survive. So we went around collecting all the different yogurts and making multicultural yogurt, and we did workshops on it, and we put videos in the library, and we made this huge tent. In any case, I was obsessed with yogurt for like a year. And because I had to craft how this political legal organization worked, MYCP, I created the legal structure for it, and I wanted to know how the devotees would vote. So I called it liquid democracy. I basically took the ideas for voting through social networks for scientific peer review and applied it to this political process. And because I was obsessed with yogurt, it kind of just that's so. Okay.
It's quite funny, actually. I like the wordplay and all of this.
Yeah, I like words. And what else I liked? I also lots of, so a lot of the things that were experiments in art space inform the design of software and the design of political institutions. So I don't know. I could tell you a story about a currency project that I did.
Yeah,
sure.
Is it currency as in regular currency, or was this also a play on words in some kind?
So I had been involved in Let's, time banks, and then made digital currencies for a while.
So
and
time bank is just you
just swap hours. So my hour is the same as your hour. So there's no difference in the rates between people.
Right. So if I need help with something, I can ask for an hour of your time.
So a lawyer's hour is worth the same, and I can tell you some fun, mad stories about that. I mean, that's really hearing these stories and experiencing them make you understand what money really is, and how if you introduce it into a space where it doesn't exist, how it can transform that space.
Oh, wow. Yeah, maybe one of those stories would be good. So,
all right, this one comes from Edgar Kahn, who's the founder of Time Banks, and I met him when he first came over to this country. I was on the Time Banks advisory board when they were setting it up before I think it became Time Banks UK, and he basically was a Midwestern lawyer, Washington State way, and went to LSE because he had this idea. Someone recommended that he go there, and then basically simplified a lot of the currency stuff and went back to and started the first time bank in the States. And
so for a time bank to work, you need a relatively small group of people who all know each other a little bit, or does it scale?
There's no reason that's the way it's been done, like Let's. But again,
and what's a Let?
Local economic trading systems, and it's basically kind of, the various forms, but it's really a mutual credit system. So you have a ledger, I have a ledger, I countersign that, and the money is issued in the process of us doing some sort of transaction rather than a central bank. And all we care about is that balances up. And so money grows and goes down again with the activities of the community. You can also call it the bank of me, instead of banks issuing a certain amount of currency that we then take out based on debt or going into debt.
But it means I need to maintain different ledgers with different people, though, or not?
No, I've just got my ledger with a whole history of transactions. And you can just do it on paper. I sign it, you sign it, that's a valid one, and it's just double entry bookkeeping, you've got the same. And I then encounter someone else and we do it, and I've now got -10 or plus 100, and I can start doing it. And the interesting question usually comes up there: how much do you let people go overdrawn? And sometimes there are rules, and sometimes you just base it and you let the community say, well, I'm not trading with someone if they're like 10,000 overdrawn. They're dodgy, it's immoral, or whatever the judgment around that is. But time banks are much more kind of, I just really basically call it a dating agency. It just gives you an excuse to interact with other people reciprocally, which is actually usually quite difficult to do.
Interesting. It's like the whole David Graeber argument about how debt originally was a form of social interaction in many ways, where he talks about how if you give me a gift or something and then I give you a gift of equal value, then that's seen as quite disrespectful, because I'm essentially terminating the arrangement that we have, and I no longer give you an excuse to talk to me, because if you owed a debt or were owed a debt, then you have a reason to.
I wouldn't call that an argument. I'd just say that's true. Flat out true.
But it doesn't feel like that, though, because I think
it's just because we don't.
Well, his argument is that in the UK and the US and places like this, we assume that debts are bad. So our instinct is to try and get to zero balance. So no one owes me anything and I don't owe anyone else anything. But he argues that in previous societies, that was actually the prime form of social interaction, where it's quite helpful to have debts owed to someone else, because now you have a reason to talk to them.
Debt's what creates our money supply. So, if everyone cancelled their debt, there would be zero money.
Yeah. But so I guess coming back to time banks, we were talking about, you said some stories of things that you learned.
So he makes up this system, just some wacky system, and a paper he published, and he starts it. The first place he starts it, or one of the first places he starts it, in the equivalent of, I don't know what they call them in the States, citizens advice bureaus.
Okay.
And something interesting had happened to them in the previous years, which had dramatically increased their workload, which was Clinton, I believe, introduction of the minimum wage. And so basically lots of businesses weren't paying out the minimum wage, and then people would complain, then they'd be kicked out. And so someone would come to the Citizen Advice Bureau and say, look, here are my wage slips, here's this proof, I've been sacked, they weren't paying me the minimum wage, what can you do to help me? And the person on the other side would say, well, I got good news and I got bad news. I mean, the good news is you got really good evidence. You will win in court. But the bad news is we got a real backlog, and it's going to take on average of 6 years to get to court. We're not properly funded, and we've only got so many lawyers that can take it to court, and the companies string it out, and that's it. So if you can wait and the guy says, well, I've got no income, I can't pay my rent, I don't even know if I'm going to be in this area, and walks out. And they just had this huge, and they tried everything, and they couldn't shift this backlog. And then he introduced the time bank. And this is both a sort of serious story and quite a funny one, I think. So the first thing he did when he introduced the time bank is go around the big legal firms. And he said, look, we've got this new mechanism, right? And the legal firms in Washington do a lot of pro bono work, partly because their main clients are big government and they want to, look good. And, they also didn't feel it very satisfactory, because they would do this work. They didn't necessarily get any feedback or interaction from the people they were doing it from, and so forth. And now I could go to them and say, here, I'd like you to promise 100 hours to this community. And when you put in 100 hours, they will match it with 100 hours of their time. And if you want, you could direct it. You could get them to clean up a local park, and you could put your plaque on there, or what have you. And that was two advantages. One, it gave them a very manageable interface. It wasn't an open-ended book. 100 hours, they could just manage it, schedule it, book it, right? And two, they now started to feel that they were being matched in this effort by the community. They liked the idea. So they raised like £500,000 worth of legal time donated to the time bank. So now, same thing happens again. The worker comes in with his wage slips and sort of all this evidence, and the counsellor or the legal advisor on the other side would say the same roughly. I've got good news for you and I've got bad news for you. The good news for you is you've got excellent evidence, and I can also get you to High Court within 6 months, right? Or 3 months or something like this. And you will definitely win. And he said, well, what's the bad news? Well, the bad news is the reason I can take you to court is these lawyers have said that they will provide so much hours if the community matches it. So this court case is going to take 30 hours or whatever it is, 100 hours. I need you to commit or pay for it with 100 hours of your time or 30 hours of your time to some community project.
But it's not going directly to the lawyers. So it's
going to the bank.
It's going to the bank.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's just acting like money,
Right.
So if I earn some money doing something for a neighbour, I got that. I can now pay for my lawyer, right?
And who decides how the bank spends money or spends hours?
The banker. I mean, everyone has their own. It just works exactly like money. Everyone has their balance, and the bank can have a balance as well. Yeah. The guy would basically just say, fuck off. You're paid. You're a public official. I've just lost my job, right? You're being paid to help me, and you're asking me to work. And the guy'd say, well, I'm sorry, that was what the lawyers said. There's nothing I can do about it. Take it or leave it. Yeah. This is where it becomes funny.
Okay.
So what then happens is, you imagine yourself being the time broker, the banker there. You've got $500,000 worth of legal time at your disposal, and now you've got 20,000 community hours that you can spend, right, sitting there in your bank account. So what they decided to do was organise like a 24-hour picket outside the factory owner's home, so they could get dinners brought, placards being made. They could organise the community rota of the protest, and these people lived in kind of these communities where they'd walk their kids to school, and Now imagine you're a factory owner. You've got someone protesting on your lawn. All your neighbours can see it, not paying minimum wage all weekend. And, you've got shit hot lawyers on your case and you're going to lose in court in 6 months. They all settled out of court without ever having to use the legal time.
Interesting. Okay.
So none of the legal time was spent, right? And it didn't cost anyone any money apart from the administration to set up the system, and the problem solved, right?
But then that means that this time banking thing essentially became more of a political tool than because
it's social work. I don't know why you say political tool. That's just social work. That's just citizen advice. But you can use it. So then there are other stories I can tell you about it being used in depression, GPs prescribing it, and so forth.
Well, I guess the story that's funny in this is it seems as though the whole thing that the time bank was created for, which was facilitating this transaction between legal time and other people's time, just ended up not being needed because the factory.
In other words, the community could always have done that.
Yeah.
But it's exactly the same as with any business. Imagine trying to organise a business without having any accounting or any cash and just sort of saying, please do that or do this or do that, right? Okay. It just allows you to structure and pool and combine small bits of labour from different people and everyone to feel it is fair. And so you can create more complex social structures out of it. The community always had the ability to solve the problem.
Right.
But you couldn't coordinate that community because there was no mechanism to coordinate it. But what is kind of interesting is that you sprinkle this kind of money on a situation and it suddenly all dissolves. And that's the magic of these of money in general and of these forms of money, is you can create forms of money that aren't backed by, I don't know, real assets or things you can buy in the shop, but they can still completely transform the working relationships of millions of people.
Yeah.
The reason it never took off in any big, there are hundreds of thousands of them all around the world, but is a different thing. And that is a strange cultural thing, which is basically the people who do this were non-technical and were socially orientated and also interested in local community growth and empowerment. So they did it that way. And in terms of currency design, all of that's a disaster. Because the things that really work are these sorts of similar exchanges on the internet for, students making videos or musicians or cultural indices, because it's very hard to get a critical mass of people in one local area. And it's very, but it's very easy to make a huge critical infrastructure of exchanges on the internet. But the whole ideology of the people in community development and in the kind of ecology type movements was against that sort of remote kind of transactional stuff. And so it was never applied to those communities.
So they had no desire to scale it up, basically.
And they didn't know anything. They wouldn't make a mobile app. They wouldn't do that sort of stuff. It's only really in the last maybe 4 or 5 years and still now there aren't any mobile apps. They're just about getting around to it. I would go and beg them and to do this sort of stuff. But you've got someone who's like 55, 60 years old. They're not a programmer. They're a community development person. They've got their funding for that particular reason to work in the local community from the local council. They're not interested in getting Japanese video editors together with, this sort of thing, and that's where that movement came from.
It's interesting. Yeah, at least in that particular example, it also just seems like